Thank you very much, Rita, for the introduction. Suruwami Hermatolab Kaida Tabu study the on the internet or the virtual conference. Pay my respect to all of you who are joining us from wherever you may be. Good morning to all of you. Half a day from beautiful island of Guam. I begin with maybe a brief explanation of the chant that we just did previous to this, where my uncle, great uncle Baskas Mark, is here to join me, bestowing that, giving me the permission to speak on his behalf and on behalf of those who came before us from that lineage. Rita mentioned that Mark is from my mother's side lineage, who is from Pulot. And so, as some of you may know, Pulot, like Sarawal and all the other outer islands, have held on to this traditional indigenous knowledge. For Mark and myself, our ancestors goes all the way back to their land that is known as Hafrush. And Hafrush is underneath the ocean. At some point in time, when our ancestors saw the threat that they were seeing coming, this current of change that was going to threaten their knowledge, they decided that the best way to hold on and keep that wisdom was to sink their island and go down thousands of feet below the ocean. And somewhere along the way, some of them decided that they should go up, and they carved their canoes out of coral heads that you could still see today on some of those islands. They voyaged across the region and settled different places. And for us, in Puluat, they settled on the estate known as Hapoila, literally translating that to be half underneath the ocean. That is the origin of Mark and myself, where we have come from, and it is essential that he bestowed that permission for me to speak on their behalf. And also, the second chant that we did was we call it Sumetal, or at least 2 verses of it was done to open up the sea lanes and therefore open up our meeting this morning. I'm grateful, of course, to the Chamorro people for giving us the permission to speak here on the land of Guam, and I'm indebted to them for giving that opportunity to us. This morning, I want to just highlight a few things with regards to this sacred knowledge of navigation that has been passed on. You know, the navigation as we know it encompasses a lot of other sacred knowledge that are part of it. And I will be talking about some of them. To become one of those navigators, you walk that line of ensuring that all the knowledge that is required and essential for seafaring, you obtain them along the way. For it is clear that a navigator cannot be a navigator had he not have a single hull canoe to take him out into the ocean. And that canoe would be rendered useless also if it cannot be sustained over time, therefore having a canoe hut to protect it. So we call them the Tamayrong, or the fathers of sacred knowledge, and we identified about 10 of these sacred knowledge that are Tamayrong to us. Beginning, of course, we place them on a canoe. We will put them on the tam, or on the ama, or on the outrigger, and float with those three who sit there, namely the sinap, the tawang, and the tawyan. They get to sit out on the float there, from the master canoe carver to the builder and to the thinker. We place on the main hull of our canoe the Taubwe and Tauhuman and Palula. Here we have the navigator, the weatherman, and fortune-telling men are there. And finally, on the epep, or the extension side, we place Tauerus, Tautafe, Tauje, and the Hamod, or the chief. They sit there. This is the spiritual component of the voyage. So we have the herbal medicinal men, the masseuse, and the spirit men, all have their own position. Point being that we have a all-round system that requires for us to learn along the way as we're growing into becoming a seafarer. In the islands, the canoe house is our center of learning that allows for us to begin at a very young age to learn from the elders before we start picking up the adze and start learning how to carve, before we start learning the voyaging side of it, and so on and so forth. But this knowledge that we have come to learn and has been passed on to us for generations also have some important unspoken, if you like, values that come along with them, including those that are of, in my opinion, relevant to us today. For example, I see that our islands are, our islands are very small. These are atolls, nothing more than 6 feet above sea level. So my island of Lamotrek and Puluat are nothing more than just 2 miles in length and 2 square miles, and 6 feet above sea level. So as such, we have a close-knit community that allows for us to drive. And for us to do that, these values that are being taught to us, aside from learning all those indigenous skills and knowledge, are those that teaches us how to respect the elders. How do we respect the natural resources that we have? So for a canoe to be carved, we would have to cut some trees. And being small and limited on resource, to cut a breadfruit tree down, it's incumbent on master canoe carvers to ensure that they could use whatever can be used that don't need to be cut down. So if a log has flowed over to the island, we have a canoe to build. That's our gift from the deity of canoe carving, and we have to make use of it. Likewise, in the seafaring practice, in voyaging, you're taught to always respect the lead navigator, or the ghost navigator, we call it, Tom Eddy, because he's the leader. And even though you think that you may know the skills or the knowledge, it's incumbent on the practice and value of traditional navigation that you follow the lead navigator all the time. And there's no questions asked of what he is capable of doing. I think these are great values that have been passed on for generations, that allows for each one of us, to live in a society that adheres to these values, because we all know that we're all also going to be growing into that someday, and those who are coming after us would benefit from it. I think I want to share with you that the idea of taking our island wisdoms, our theme, and applying it to global future is, to me, something that our ancestors have been practicing for generations. And for some reason, I'm convinced that they knew that there was going to be this big change coming, and therefore keep their wisdom thousands of feet underneath the ocean. Was something that our ancestors were well aware of, and passed on to us these values that we must sustain life on our small islands. We have very limited resources. Now we're not just threatened by globalization in some ways, but we are threatened by the impact of climate change that is happening as we speak for some of our low-lying islands. We have frequent storms that may be contrary to what our knowledge is showing us in the universe of the stars, and the currents and the ocean swells and everything else that our ancestors teach us. These storms out of nowhere, they come. We see the fast encroaching shoreline with the saltwater intrusion into our taro patches that helps us sustain lives on these small islands. That is something that we are now being faced with. And I know that as much as we are doing our part to sustain, I also know that we don't contribute any of the factors that may cause the climate change issues and all that needs to come with it. So if there is one thing that I'm hoping that we could pass on to this conference and to people outside, it is that sustainability is an ancient wisdom. Sustainability has been with us for thousands of years on these islands. We practice it. We pass it on to our younger ones because it is our survival, it is our future that we pride ourselves in, and make sure that they inherit these lands and the resources the same that we did from our ancestors, if not better. As we see today, things have kind of changed drastically, including COVID-19 that is changing a lot of things for us. Let's all come back down to earth, and if need be, go underneath the ocean some distance down to realize that we are all interdependent of each other, and most especially on our resources. I know that my colleagues would also speak to this issue of climate change, and by the way, that protection chant that we did also extends to colleagues like in Hawaii and to Vince out in Minnesota. So again, I thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning, and may I now turn the mic back to our moderator, Rita.